They bid her sit below the salt, at the far foot of the table where the candlelight thinned to shadow, and they did it gently, which was the cruelest part of all. The Duke of Vexshot watched from his place of honour at Lady Aldercott's right hand as a footman drew back the meanest chair in the hall, the one with the worn seat and the loose arm, and Lady Aldecott herself said, in a voice pitched sweet enough for the whole table to hear, "There, Honora. You will be quite comfortable amongst the lesser folk. You would not wish to be a burden to your betters." Torvald did not move. He had learned long ago to keep his face a closed door, and he kept it closed now, though something behind his ribs had begun to turn slowly, like a key finding at last the lock it was made for. The young woman they called Honora inclined her head and took the poor chair without a word of complaint. She wore a gown of grey that had been turned and pressed so many times its nap had gone to a soft sheen at the elbows, and a hem repaired with stitches so fine he could only see them because he had learned to look for the marks of quiet labour on quiet people. She did not blush. She did not weep. She folded her hands in her lap, lifted her chin the smallest degree, and looked at the flame of the nearest candle as though it were an old friend who would not abandon her, and Torvald felt the turning key click home. Around him the dinner resumed its glittering murmur. 22 guests sat beneath a chandelier heavy with wax and crystal, and the table ran the length of the great hall at Aldecott Court, like a river of silver and white damask. The daughters of the house, Sabina and Clarice, sat near the head in gowns the colour of new peaches, their curls dressed high, their laughter quick and practised. Lady Aldecott presided with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had at last landed the largest fish in 3 counties, for the Duke of Vexshot did not dine in company. Men called him the Iron Duke behind their hands, and worse things than that. He had buried a wife he had never loved and a brother he had loved too well, and he had shut the gates of his estate and let the world believe whatever ugly tale it pleased. That he had accepted Lady Aldecott's invitation at all was a triumph she intended to wear like a jewel for the rest of the season. She believed she knew why he had come. She believed he had come to look over her daughters. Torvald let her believe it. He turned the stem of his wine-glass between 2 fingers and said something civil about the fineness of the venison, and watched the foot of the table. He had not come for the daughters. He had come because a fortnight passed, on the muddy high road 2 miles from his own gates. His carriage had thrown a wheel in a downpour, and while his coachman cursed and his footman floundered, a plain woman in a grey cloak had come out from a cottage where she had been carrying broth to a sick tenant, not her cottage, no one who owed her anything, and she had knelt in the mud beside a stranger's overturned carriage, and helped an old woman traveller out of the wreck, and wrapped her own dry cloak around the woman's shoulders, and she had done it without once looking up to see whose crest was on the door. She had not known the Duke was inside. She had not cared. When at last he had climbed down, expecting the usual fluster and the usual curtsy and the usual naked calculation to bloom across a face the moment his rank was understood, she had only glanced at him, said, "There is dry shelter yonder if your people need it, sir," and gone back to chafing the old woman's hands. "Sir, not your grace." She had not known him. And in the days since, Torvald had found he could not stop thinking of the look she had given the mud, not disgust, not resignation, but a kind of steady tenderness, as though the mud too were something that could be helped if one only troubled to try. He had made discreet inquiries. It had not taken long. She was Honora Colville, orphan daughter of Lady Aldecott's late younger sister, taken into the house at 15 when her father's debts had swallowed everything, and kept these 7 years since as something between a poor relation and an unpaid servant. Sent to nurse the tenants no one else would go near, to do the accounts the steward found tedious, to sit up with Lady Aldecott through her megrims and be blamed for them in the morning. She was 22. She had no dowry, no prospects, and no protector in all the world. And she had knelt in the mud for a stranger. So Torvald had let it be known, through the proper roundabout channels, that the Duke of Vexshot might look favourably upon an invitation from Aldecott Court, and Lady Aldecott had all but fallen upon the messenger in her joy. And here he sat, watching a good woman be seated among the deaf old aunts and the impoverished curate at the cold end of the table, and finding that his temper, which he had believed long since worn down to a stump, was rising in him like a tide. "Your Grace is very quiet this evening," said Sabina Aldecott, leaning toward him so that the candlelight found the pearls at her throat. "I hope our poor country table does not bore you. Mama says you keep the grandest cellar in the kingdom. Your mother is misinformed," Torvald said. "I keep a modest one. I drink little." Sabina laughed as though he had made a great wit, and her sister laughed to match her, and their mother beamed, and none of them heard the flatness in his voice, because people who have decided you are charmed by them will hear charm in a funeral bell. Down at the foot of the table, Honora Colville was passing the salt cellar to the deaf old curate with a small private smile, saying something that made his whole seamed face light up like a lamp. Torvald could not hear what it was. He found he wanted, quite badly, to hear it. "Tell me, Lady Aldecott," he said, setting down his glass, "the young woman at the end of your table, in grey. I do not believe we have been introduced." A stillness passed over the near end of the table, quick as a cloud over the sun. Lady Aldecott's smile did not falter, but something moved behind her eyes, a calculation and then a swift correction. "Oh, that is only Honora," she said, with a little laugh meant to close the subject like a fan. "My late sister's girl. A charity of ours, your grace, nothing to trouble yourself over. She is not, that is, she does not go into company as a rule. She is more useful about the house. You understand." "I do not think I do," said Torvald. The words came out quiet, but they carried, the way a low word from a man like Torvald always carried, because a room that has spent an evening straining to please him has trained itself to hang on every syllable he lets fall. Down the table, Fawkes paused. Clarice glanced at her mother. The old curate blinked. Lady Aldecott recovered admirably. "She is a dear, good girl," she said warmly, patting the air as though patting a dog. "But you know how these things are. Blood will tell, and her poor mother married quite beneath us, and the child was left with nothing at all, and out of Christian duty we took her in. One cannot expect her to shine at a table such as this. She knows her place, bless her. She is quite content, is she?" said Torvald. He looked down the long table again. Honora had heard, of course she had heard. The whole hall had heard, and the tips of her ears had gone pink, but she had not lowered her eyes. She was looking back at Lady Aldecott with an expression of such composed, unhurried dignity, such absolute refusal to be made small in her own estimation, that Torvald felt the last of his patience with this gilded, well-fed cruelty go out of him like a snuffed wick. Content. They had a word for what they had done to her, and the word was content, and they said it the way one might say a horse was well broken. "She has the look of her mother, I dare say," Torvald said pleasantly. "I knew a Colville once." He did not. The lie came easily and served its purpose, which was to make Lady Aldecott hesitate, uncertain now of what he knew and whom he knew and whether she had misjudged the currents of the evening. He watched her recalculate. He watched the daughters exchange a glance. He let the silence stretch one beat past comfort, and then he smiled, and it was not a warm smile, and everyone at the head of the table felt the temperature of room drop by a degree and did not know why. "You will forgive me," he said, and set his napkin on the table. He rose. For years later, the guests at that dinner would tell the story differently depending on their vanity, but on one point every account agreed. The Duke of Vexshot, guest of honour, seated in the place of highest esteem at Lady Aldecott's own right hand, stood up in the middle of the second course, and for one suspended instant the entire hall believed he meant to leave, and Lady Aldecott half rose in a flutter of horror, her hand going to her breast, her mouth already shaping an apology for whatever unknown offence had driven him from her table. He did not leave. He walked the length of the table. He walked past Sabina, who turned in her chair with her lips parted, past Clarice, whose peach-coloured ribbon trembled, past the magistrate and the magistrate's fat wife, past the Defonts and the country baronet, past every astonished upturned face, the long slow measure of his stride the only sound in a hall that had forgotten how to breathe. His boots rang on the stone between the carpets. The candle flames leaned and recovered, and he did not stop until he stood at the very foot of the table, at the cold end, below the salt, behind the worn chair with the loose arm where Honora Colville sat with her fine-mended hem and her folded hands gone utterly still. She looked up at him. This close, he could see that her eyes were not brown as he had thought, but a deep grey-green, the colour of the sea under cloud, and that there was fear in them, Not of him, he understood at once, but for herself, a swift animal fear of being made the center of something she could not control, of being the sport of these people yet again. He would have given a great deal, in that moment, to take that fear from her and grind it under his heel. "Miss Colville," he said. "Your Grace," she managed. Her voice was low and even, held steady by main force. "I find the air is better at this end of the room," Torvald said, and in full view of 22 guests, in full view of Lady Aldecott frozen half out of her chair with her napkin fallen to the floor, in full view of the daughters and the magistrate and the crystal chandelier and the whole bright ruin of their evening, the Duke of Vexshot took hold of an empty chair from against the wall, drew it up beside Honora Colville's, at the cold foot the table, below the salt, among the deaf and the poor and the forgotten, and sat down. He arranged his coat. He drew the chair a courteous handsbreadth nearer to hers. He looked up the long, shocked length of the table to where Lady Aldecott stood with her mouth open and no sound coming out of it, and he said, in the mildest voice in the world, "Pray do not let me interrupt. You were speaking, madam, of a person's proper place." He let that sit. "I have found mine. Do go on." No one spoke. For the length of 3 heartbeats the great hall of Aldecott Court held a silence so complete that Torvald could hear the wax of the candles ticking as it dripped, and the distant clatter of the kitchen through the closed door. And beside him the small unsteady sound of Honora Colville drawing breath. Then Lady Aldecott sat down. She did it because her knees would no longer hold her, and because there was nothing else in the world for her to do. A footman, white-faced, stooped to retrieve her fallen napkin and did not know whether to hand it to her or flee. At the head of the table Sabina had turned quite pale beneath her rouge, and Clarice was staring at her cousin at the foot of the table as though she had never seen her before. As though Honora had performed some conjuring trick, some low deceit, to draw the great Duke down the length of the room and into the shadows where she belonged. "Your Grace," Lady Aldecott began, and her voice came out cracked, and she wet her lips and tried again. "Your Grace, you cannot, that is, you must not trouble yourself so. Honora can be moved up to the head of the table directly. Sabina, dearest, change places with, a footman will bring Honora, come up at once, do not keep his Grace waiting in that dreadful chair." "The chair suits me," said Torvald, "and Miss Colville will not be moved about like a salt-cellar for anyone's convenience. She was seated here by your instruction, madam. I have merely come to keep her company. It seemed to me," and here he turned his head slowly and let his dark gaze travel the length of the table, guest by guest, until it came to rest on Lady Aldecott herself, that she had been given the worst seat in the house. A gentleman does not leave a lady to sit alone in the worst seat in the house. I had thought that a thing everyone at this table would have learned in the nursery. It appears I was mistaken. The magistrate's fat wife made a small sound and hid it in her wine. The country baronet studied his plate with sudden fascination. Every soul at that table understood that they had been weighed in a single sentence and found wanting, and that the man who had weighed them was the most powerful man any of them would ever sit down to dine with, and that there was not one thing to be done about it but sit and burn. Torvald turned his back on the lot of them. He gave Honora Colville his whole attention, and his voice, when he spoke to her, changed entirely. It dropped and gentled, losing its edge the way a drawn sword is sheathed. "Forgive me," he said, low, for her alone. "I have made you a spectacle. I could not sit and watch it. But I have made it worse, I think, before I have made it better, and for that I am sorry." Honora looked at him. The pink had not left her ears, but the fear in her sea-colored eyes had shifted into something more complicated, bewilderment and a wary, disbelieving flicker of something that was almost, not quite hope. "You are the gentleman from the high road," she said quietly. The carriage with the broken wheel, in the rain. A small crease appeared between her brows. "You were not," the servants said afterward. It had been a great nobleman's coach, and I did not believe them, for the gentleman inside said not a word about who he was, and let me put my cloak on a stranger, and thanked me as though I had done him a kindness rather than— She stopped. Her colour deepened. "That was you. That was I. You said nothing. You did not ask," said Torvald. "You were busy. It was one of the few honest half-hours I have passed in 10 years, Miss Colville, and I had no wish to spoil it by telling you my name. Names change how people kneel." You knelt the same for a stranger as you would have for a king. I have been trying to understand it ever since. She did not seem to know what to say to that. She looked down at her hands and then, because she was who she was, she gathered herself and looked back up and said, with a directness that went through him like clean water, the old woman from the carriage, "Mistress Hale, did she come to any harm?" I sent to ask after her twice, but I had no way to know if my letters reached anyone. Torvald felt the tide behind his ribs surge again. She had not asked what he wanted of her. She had not asked what his attention might mean for her fortunes, though her whole future in that house had just been overturned in front of 22 witnesses. She had asked after the old woman. "She is well," he said. "She is my aunt, as it happens. My father's youngest sister, Mistress Hale as she styles herself now, a widow these 30 years. The only member of my family I can bear the sight of. She was travelling to me when her carriage overturned, and you wrapped your cloak around her, and she has spoken of nothing else for a fortnight. She sends you this." He drew from inside his coat a small folded paper and set it beside Honora's plate. "She would not tell me what it says. She said it was between women and no business of mine." A real smile broke over Honora's face then, quick and unguarded, and Torvald understood in that instant, with the plain certainty of a man reading a map, that he intended to spend the rest of his life provoking that smile. Up the table, the dinner had lurched painfully back into motion. Lady Aldecott had begun to talk very fast and very brightly about nothing at all, and her daughters had joined her, and the guests were grateful for the noise and hurled themselves into it, so that the far end of the room was left to its own devices. And Torvald and Honora sat in a small pool of privacy at the cold foot of the table, and it was, he thought, the warmest corner of the house. Eat something, he told her, for he had noticed her plate was near empty, and the dishes had been sent up the table and never sent down. "They have been starving you at your own family's board. Here." And he did a thing that was talked of in 3 counties for a year afterward. The Duke of Vexshot served a lady with his own hands, spooning venison and buttered roots onto Honora Colville's plate from the platters he commandeered by the simple expedient of catching a footman's eye and holding it until the man leapt to obey. He filled her wine-glass. He broke bread and set it by her hand. He did it plainly, without flourish, the way a man does a thing that is only right, and every act of it was a hammer blow struck against the wall Lady Aldecott had spent 7 years building around this girl to keep her small. "Your Grace," Honora murmured, "you must not. They will make me pay for this when you are gone." She said it without self-pity, as a plain matter of fact, the way she might have noted that it would rain by morning, and it was the flatness of it, the practiced expectation of punishment, that told Torvald more about the last 7 years of her life than any inquiry could have done. He set down the serving spoon. For a moment he did not trust himself to speak. "Listen to me," he said, when he could. "I will not be gone. Do you understand? Not in the way you mean. I did not walk the length of that table to warm my hands and then leave you to the cold when the door shut behind me. I am not a man who does things by halves, Miss Colville. It is nearly the only thing the world says of me that is true. When I choose, I choose. And I have chosen to sit here tonight, and I will choose it again tomorrow, and I will keep choosing it until you are so tired of the sight of me that you send me away yourself, which you may do. That door I leave open, but no other." She stared at him, her lips parted. Whatever she had been braced against all her life, it had not been this, and she had no armor made to meet it. He could see her searching herself for the trick, for the cruelty folded inside the kindness, the way there had always been cruelty folded inside kindness in that house, and finding none, and not knowing what to do with its absence. "Why?" she said at last, very low. "You do not know me, Your Grace. You have seen me twice. I am nobody. I have nothing, no name to speak of, no fortune, no beauty that anyone here has ever troubled to see. You could have any lady in the kingdom. Why would you cross a room for me?" Torvald considered the question as seriously as it had been asked, because it deserved seriousness, and because he owed her the truth. "Because you knelt in the mud," he said. "Because you asked after an old woman before you asked after yourself, tonight, when your whole life had just come loose in front of you. Because when they seated you below the salt, you did not weep and you did not rage. You lifted your chin and you kept your dignity in a room that had agreed to strip it from you, and that, Miss Colville, is a thing I have not seen a duchess do. You want beauty. I have seen 100 beautiful faces across 100 tables and forgotten every one before the carriage reached the gate. I will not forget yours. I have tried for a fortnight and I cannot." He paused. "You ask me why. That is why. It is the whole of it, and it is enough." Honora Colville, who had not wept when they sat her below the salt, who had not wept in 7 years in that house, pressed her lips together very hard and turned her face toward a candle, so that the man beside her would not see, and Torvald, who understood, looked away and gave her the moment, and reached without seeming to and moved the little folded note from his aunt an inch nearer her hand, and waited. At the head of the table, Lady Aldecott watched the 2 dark heads bent together at the foot of her hall, and her heart, which was not large, was full of a black and rising water. She had schemed a season for this dinner. She had bought new gowns for her girls on credit she could ill afford. She had meant to bind the Iron Duke's fortune to her house, and she had seated the ruin of all hopes below the salt in a mended grey gown and told her to keep quiet. And now the Duke was breaking bread with her charity girl and would not so much as look the length of the table, and every guest in the room had seen it. And by noon tomorrow every drawing-room in the county would know that the Duke of Vexshot had chosen the poor relation over the daughters of the house. She smiled. She smiled, and she said something gay to the magistrate, and beneath the table her fingers closed on the damask cloth and twisted it until her knuckles went white, and she began, in the cold clockwork of her mind, to plan. Honora would pay for this. Honora would pay for all of it. There were 100 ways to break a girl who had nowhere else in the world to go, and Lady Aldecott, watching the candlelight on her enemy's bent head, resolved to use every one of them before she would suffer this humiliation to stand. When the covers were drawn and the moment came for the ladies to withdraw and leave the gentlemen to their port, Lady Aldecott rose and gathered her guests with a bright, practised sweep, and Honora rose with the rest, and for one cold instant the 2 ends of the table were made to meet. The daughters sweeping past the foot in a rustle of peach silk, Sabina's eyes raking Honora head to hem with a look that would have curdled milk. In the drawing-room, among the coffee and the candles, the ladies of the county arranged themselves, and Honora, uncertain of her place as always, made to withdraw to a corner seat by the door out of the way. But Lady Aldecott was not finished with her. "Come and sit by me, Honora," she said sweetly, patting the sofa, and there was steel under the sweetness that only Honora could hear. When the girl came and sat, Lady Aldecott leaned close under cover of pouring the coffee and murmured, for her alone, "You have had a merry evening, have you not? You have enjoyed yourself very much, being made a fool of before the whole county. You think he means it, do you? A man like that. He is diverting himself, you poor stupid creature. He will grow bored of the novelty before the leaves are down, and when he is gone you will still be here, and I will remember every smile you have smiled tonight. Enjoy them while they last. You will pay for each one." She straightened and said aloud warmly to the room, "Honora is such a comfort to me. I do not know how the household should go on without her." And the county ladies smiled and thought what a kind woman Lady Aldecott was, to make so much of a charity girl, and Honora sat with her coffee cooling in her hands and understood that the war she had not asked for had been declared. In the dining-room, meanwhile, the port went round, and the gentlemen settled to it, and the Duke of Vexshot sat among them and was, for perhaps a quarter of an hour, unusually forthcoming, asking the old chaplain, Mr. Fenn, a great many gentle questions, and listening to the answers with an attention that made the deaf old man flower like a plant brought in from the frost. Lord Aldecott, uneasy, tried once or twice to steer the great man's talk toward his daughters, and got nowhere, and drank rather more than was good for him, and grew quiet. And then the Duke of Vexshot did a thing that no man at that table had ever seen a guest do. He set down his glass barely touched and rose, and said that he thought he would rejoin the ladies, for he found he had no great head for port, and a much greater wish for conversation, and he went, leaving the gentlemen staring after him, for a man does not quit the port to seek out the drawing-room unless there is someone in the drawing-room he cannot bear to be an hour apart from, and every man at that table knew it, and knew who it was. The carriage that carried the Duke of Vexshot away from Aldecott Court that night rolled out through the gates near midnight, and Torvald did not sleep. He sat in the dark of the swaying coach with his aunt's second note, for he had, in the hour after dinner, prevailed upon Mistress Hale to receive a letter he meant to write, and had learned a great deal, and he watched the black hedgerows slide past and thought about the shape of the trap he had walked into and the shape of the one he now meant to build. He had not misjudged the household. He had underjudged it. In the crowded hour after the covers were drawn, while the ladies withdrew and the gentlemen sat over their port, Torvald had made himself agreeable, a rare and unsettling thing, and drawn out the old curate at his elbow. A mild half-deaf man named Mr. Fenn, who had been the Aldecott chaplain for 30 years and who, once he understood the Duke was truly listening, spoke with the loose gratitude of a man long unheard, and Mr. Fenn had told him about Honora's mother, Lady Aldecott's younger sister, it seemed. A Miss Marian, in the days before both girls were married, had been the beauty of the family and the favour of their father, old Sir Hugh, and had thrown it all away, the family said, by marrying a Mr. Colville, a scholar and a gentleman of no fortune whom she loved. The elder sister, Lady Aldecott that was, had married rank and land and a chill in the heart, and had never forgiven Marian for being loved. When Marian and her husband died within a season of each other of the same low fever, and the debts were cried, the child Honora had been sent for. Out of Christian duty, as Lady Aldecott was fond of saying, and she had spent 7 years paying, in scrubbed floors and sleepless sick-beds and slights administered daily like a medicine, for the crime of being her mother's daughter. But that was not the whole of it, Mr. Fenn had said, growing uneasy, glancing toward the door. Old Sir Hugh had died only the year before last. And Mr. Fenn, who had witnessed the old man's last as a matter of form, had always understood, though it was not his place to say, and he had said nothing, for who would have listened to him? That Sir Hugh, at the very end, softening toward the memory of his lost favourite, had left a portion, a small estate that had been Marian's own dower, held back, kept in trust, for Marian's child, for Honora, to come to her at her marriage, or at her 25th year, whichever should first arrive. Honora was 22. She had never been told. And the trustee of that small estate, the man who held it and drew its rents and had for 2 years let his sister's orphan scrub his wife's floors while inheritance ripened quietly in a lawyer's box, was Lord Aldecott himself. Torvald had sat very still over his port when he understood it. So that was the shape of it, not merely spite, though there was spite enough to fuel a furnace. There was money in it. There was a small clean estate worth some 800 a year that would slip out of Aldecott's hands the day Honora Colville married or came of age at 25. And it was very much in the family's interest that she should do neither, that she should stay unwed, unnoticed, uninformed, a drudge and a dependent, until the years wore her down to nothing, and perhaps, if the family were fortunate, she would take fright at her prospects and go into a convent or a governess's post far away and never trouble to look into her rights at all. And into that careful arrangement, the Duke of Vexshot had walked in the rain and lost his heart over a broken carriage wheel. He smiled in the dark. It was not a pleasant smile, and there was no one to see it. He would not tell her yet. Not the inheritance. That was a weapon, and he would not put a weapon into the hand of a woman who did not yet trust him enough to know he would never let her be hurt by the wielding of it. He would find the proof first. He would set his own man of business, discreet as the grave, to draw the true copy of Sir Hugh's will from the registry where such things must by law be lodged, and he would learn the exact estate and the exact terms, and then, when the ground was solid beneath his feet, he would strike. In the meantime he would do the simplest and most powerful thing a man in his position could do, which was to make it impossible for Lady Aldecott to hide Honora ever again. He would court her openly, in the light, where all the county could see. His aunt was waiting up for him when the carriage came at last through the gates of Vexshot, though it was long past 1 in the morning. He saw the light in her sitting-room window and knew she would not sleep until she had had the whole of it out of him. Augusta Hale was near 80, and had buried a husband and 2 sons and outlived most of her friends, and she had emerged from all of it not soft but tempered, like a blade too old to break, and she alone in the world was permitted to speak to the Duke of Vexshot exactly as she pleased. He found her by her fire with a shawl about her shoulders and a look of undisguised, avid impatience on her seamed face. Well, she said, before he had got his gloves off. Sit down and tell me everything, and do not you dare leave out the parts you think an old woman ought not to hear, for I am past the age of blushing and I mean to know it all. Did you find her? The girl from the road? I found her. Torvald sat heavily in the chair across from hers and stared into the fire, and something in his face made his aunt lean forward and go quiet. They seated her below the salt Augusta, at her own family's table, in a mended gown. They told the whole room she was a charity, a burden, a nobody kept out of Christian duty, and they said it to her face with 22 people listening, and his jaw worked. She lifted her chin and bore it. She did not weep. She passed the salt to the old curate and made him smile. And I looked at her sitting there at the cold end of that table, being made small by people not fit to carry her shoe, and I got up and I walked the length of the room and I sat down beside her, in front of all of them. Augusta Hale was silent a moment. Then she said, with enormous satisfaction, "Did you, by God," and sat back, and there was a suspicious brightness in her old eyes. You sat down beside her below the salt, in front of the county. Oh, I would have given 10 years of what is left to me to have seen Prudence Aldercott's face. She reached across and gripped his hand with her thin, strong fingers. You did right. Do you hear me, Torvald? For 10 years I have watched you shut yourself up in this great cold barn of a house, and let the world call you iron, and I have grieved that a good man should waste his one heart on grief for a marriage that was never worth the grieving. And now you cross a room for a girl who knelt in mud for me and asked no one's leave to kind. You did right. Do not let anyone, not the county, not those grasping women, not your own black doubts at 3 in the morning, talk you out of it. I do not mean to, said Torvald. But it is worse than spite, Augusta. I have learned tonight there is money in it. And he told her, the suppressed will, the dower estate, the 2 years of stolen rents, the whole cold architecture of the girl's smallness. And his aunt listened with her mouth pressed to a hard line and her hand tightening on the arm of her chair. And when he had done she said one word, low, that a lady of her generation was not supposed to know, and then she said, "What will you do? Court her openly, where they cannot hide her. Set Merrow to draw the true copy of the will, and when the ground is solid, strike." He looked at his aunt. "I will not tell her about the inheritance yet. She does not trust me enough to know I would never use it to bind her. If I go to her tomorrow and say, 'You are an heiress and I will get it for you,' I become only one more person who wants a thing from her, and she has had a lifetime of people who wanted things. I want her to choose me first, before she knows she is worth a penny. So that when it comes out, she will always know that I crossed the room when she had nothing." Augusta Hale looked at her nephew for a long moment, and something in her face was very tender and very proud and a little bit grieved for all the years he had gone without this. "You have thought it through," she said. "You always did think everything through. It is why you are so unbearable at cards. Well, court her in the light, and Torvald, bring her here, to me. When you can, when the poor child can slip her keepers, bring her to this fire. I owe her my life, and I have a great deal I should like to say to her about her mother, whom I knew, and whom that woman helped to break. Now go to bed. You look like a man who has seen a ghost, and in a manner of speaking I suppose you have, your own, the one that has been waiting 10 years for someone to sit down beside." The next morning he sent flowers. Not a modest posy, but a great extravagant sheaf of them, hothouse blooms out of his own glasshouses that no gift in that country had ever rivaled, and with them a card in his own hand that said only, "I have not changed my mind. I do not intend V." And because he was not a fool, and because he knew exactly what would happen to those flowers and that card the instant they entered Lady Aldercott's house if they came addressed to Honora alone, he addressed the whole to Lady Aldecott, with a note begging that her ladyship would be so good as to permit him to wait upon Miss Colville that afternoon, as he wished to further his acquaintance with the young lady, and adding, this was the barb inside the courtesy, that he had spoken warmly of Aldecott hospitality to the Lord Lieutenant of the county that very morning, and looked forward to speaking of it warmly again. Lady Aldecott read the note 3 times. Then she went very quietly upstairs to the cold north room under the eaves where Honora slept, and she stood in the doorway, and she smiled, and she said, "It seems you have made a conquest, niece. His Grace wishes to call on you. How clever you have been." Honora, who had been up since 5 carrying coals, straightened slowly from the grate. She had learned, in 7 years, to read the weather of that smile the way a shepherd reads the sky. "I did nothing, aunt," she said. "I would not have gone into the dining room at all if you had not commanded it." "No," Lady Aldecott agreed, still smiling. "You did nothing. You never do anything, do you, Honora? Things simply happen to you, and the family bears the cost." She came into the room. She touched the thin coverlet on the narrow bed, the single tallow candle, the small stack of books that were Honora's only reaches, 3 volumes rescued from her father's ruin. She let her hand rest on them a moment, a warning, though she said nothing. "You will receive his grace this afternoon," she went on. "You will wear the blue muslin, Clarice's cast-off it will do, and you will be pleasant to him, for it does the house no harm to have a duke's notice, even upon a person such as yourself. But you will not, I think, allow yourself any foolish imaginings. You are a sensible girl. You know what you are. A great man amuses himself with a novelty for a week, and then he tires of it and goes home, and the novelty is left where he found her, only a little more ridiculous than before. You would not wish to be ridiculous, Honora. You would not wish to come a burden by presuming above your station and making the family a laughingstock, would you?" said Honora quietly. "No," said Lady Aldecott. "I thought not." She went to the door. There she paused. "And Honora, if his grace should ask you, as men in the flush of a fancy sometimes do, whether you are happy here, whether you are well used, whether there is anything you lack," the smile again, thin as a blade, "you will tell him that you are the most fortunate girl in England, and that your family has been all goodness to you, and that you want for nothing in the world. Because if you do not, my dear, and if you set that dangerous man against the people who have fed and housed and clothed you out of pure charity for 7 long years, then when he tires of you, and he will tire of you, you will find there is no longer any roof in England open to an ungrateful girl with a slandering tongue and not a penny to her name. Do we understand one another?" Honora looked at her aunt across the little cold room, and something happened in her face that Lady Aldecott, in her satisfaction, did not trouble to read closely. A stillness, a settling, the quiet of a person who has just heard, in another's threat, the exact measure of that other's fear. "She is afraid," Honora thought with a clarity that startled her. "All these years I have thought she despised me because I am worth nothing. But you do not threaten a thing that is worth nothing. You do not stand in a scullery maid's doorway and warn her, 3 times over, to hold her tongue. She is afraid of what I might say. She is afraid of him. Why? We understand one another," Aunt Honora said aloud and dropped her eyes, because 7 years had taught her that too, when to let them believe they had won. Lady Aldecott swept satisfied. And Honora sat down on the narrow bed and drew from beneath her pillow the little folded note that Mistress Hale had sent her by the Duke's own hand, which she had read a dozen times already, and read it once more. It was written in an old woman's spidery, generous hand, and it said, "Child, I owe you my life and I do not forget my debts, but that is the smallest part of what I mean to say. My nephew is the best man I know and the loneliest, and he has not looked at a living soul with hope in 10 years, and last night he came home from your table lit up like a boy. Whatever they have told you that you are not. I knew your mother a little long ago. She had your face. She was the kindest creature in 3 counties, and they broke her heart for the crime of marrying for love, and have grieved that I did nothing. I am too old to do nothing twice. If ever you need a friend with a warm fire and a sharp tongue and no fear of your grand relations, you have only to come to me. Burn this if you must, but believe it first. Augusta Hale." Honora did not burn it. She folded it small and hid it deeper against her heart, and she went down to face the afternoon and the Duke, with her chin already lifting. He came at 3, and the whole house was in an uproar of preparation that Honora watched from the edges with a strange calm. The good drawing-room was opened and aired. Sabina and Clarice were dressed as though for a ball and posed about the room with their embroidery, which none of them ever touched from 1 month to the next. Lady Aldecott had put on her garnets, and Honora was set in the least comfortable chair, in the borrowed blue muslin that fit her badly at the shoulders, and instructed by a glance to be silent and grateful and forgettable. The Duke of Vexshot was announced. He came in, And he bowed to Lady Aldecott precisely as much as courtesy required, and not 1 degree more, and he greeted the daughters with a cool civility that made Sabina's practiced smile falter, and then he crossed the room, past all of them, to where Honora sat in the bad chair by the window, and he took her hand and bowed over it as though she were the only woman in England. "Miss Colville," he said, "you are well, I hope." "Quite well, your grace," said Honora. "You are very good to call." "I said I would," said Torvald. "I keep my word." "It is a tedious habit, and it has made me a great many enemies." He glanced once at Lady Aldecott, and there was something in the glance that made her look quickly down at her garnets. "Will you walk with me? The afternoon is fine, and I am told the gardens here are worth seeing. Your aunt will not object to our taking the air, I am sure, in full view of the house, and with your cousins to bear us company if she wishes it." It was neatly done. He had made it impossible to refuse without an open rudeness that would have to be explained, and impossible to hedge Honora about with too many chaperones without seeming to distrust a duke in her own garden. Lady Aldecott, cornered, gave a gracious assent and dispatched Clarice to walk 20 paces behind, and Torvald offered Honora his arm, and they went out into the September gardens where the last roses were blowing loose, and the light came golden and slantwise across the clipped yew. And for the first time in 7 years, Honora Colville walked out of that house on the arm of someone who had come for her sake alone. They walked in silence a little way. Clarice trailed sulkily behind, out of earshot but not out of sight, and Torvald slowed his stride to match Honora's and did not fill the quiet with talk, which she found she was grateful for. "You need not perform for me," he said at last, low. "I saw you set at the least chair in the room, and dressed in a gown that does not fit you, and posted by the window like a plant that has been put out of the way. I know exactly what this afternoon is, Miss Colville. It is a play your aunt has arranged in which you are to be pleasant and dull, and I am to grow bored and go away, and leave her daughters to gather up whatever is left of my attention. I have watched 100 such plays. I have grown very good at spoiling them." He glanced down at her. "I will spoil this one, if you will let me, but only if you will let me. If I have mistaken you, if you would truly rather I went away and left you in peace, you have only to say so plainly and I will go, and you will never be troubled by me again. I mean that. Your peace is not mine to spend against your will." Honora walked a few steps more. A blackbird sang somewhere in the yew. She was aware of the warmth of his arm beneath her hand, and of the impossible strangeness of being actually asked what she wanted, a question no one had put to her since her father died. "I do not want you to go away," she said. The words came out barely above a whisper, and having said them she felt as though she had stepped off a high place into air, and could not take them back and did not wish to. "But I am afraid, your grace. I will tell you the truth since you have told me yours. I am afraid of hoping. Hope has been the most expensive thing in my life. Every time I have let myself want a kind word, or a warm room, or a person who might simply stay, it has been taken, and the taking has cost me more than the going without ever would. I learned to want nothing. It is the only wealth a person like me is allowed to keep." She lifted her chin, that small brave gesture he had already come to know. "You are asking me to want something very large, and I do not know how I will bear it if it is taken too." Torvald stopped walking. They had come to the far end of the yew walk, where an old stone bench sat beneath a 4 late roses, and beyond the hedge the deer park rolled away gold and green to the blue distance, and Clarice, 20 paces back, had stopped too and was pretending to examine a rosebush. "Then let me tell you a thing about myself," Torvald said, "and you may decide what it is worth. I was married once. You may have heard. The county tells the story with relish. My father arranged it when I was 23, to a lady of great fortune and greater beauty, and I did as I was bid. Because I had been raised to do as I was bid, and we were both of us miserable for 6 years, because we had married a contract and not a person, and there was nothing between us but cold civility and disappointment. She died. I grieved for her, not as a husband should grieve for a wife he loved, for I never loved her, and that is the shame I carry, but as one grieves for a fellow prisoner who died in the next cell, having wasted her one life as I was wasting mine. And I swore, when I had buried her, that I would never again let another soul choose for me whom I would give my life to. That if I ever married again, and I did not think I would, it would be because I had crossed a room of my own free will and sat down beside the one person in it I could not bear to leave, do you see? He looked at her steadily. I have already crossed the room, Honora. I did it in front of your whole family with 22 people watching. I am not a boy in the flush of a fancy, whatever your aunt has told you. I am a man of 38 who has been alone a very long time and knows precisely what he wants when at last he sees it. I am not going to be taken from you. The only way you lose me is to send me away, and I do not think you are going to do that. Honora's eyes had filled. She turned her face aside toward the deer park and the gold distance, and she said in a voice that shook, "You should not say such things where my cousin can see. My aunt will." And then she stopped and drew a breath and said something braver instead. "I am tired of measuring my words against what my aunt will do. Let her see, let them all see." She turned back to him. "I do not want you to go away, Your Grace. I have not wanted anything so much in 7 years, and it terrifies me, and I am saying it anyway. There, you have made me spend hope. I hope you know what it costs." "I do," said Torvald gravely. "I will spend the rest of my life seeing that is repaid with interest." They stood a moment in the falling gold light, and neither of them touched the other beyond his arm and her hand, for they were people of their time, and the cousin was watching, and the thing between them was too new and too grave to be rushed. But something was settled in that walk that neither of them ever afterward doubted, and when they turned to walk back to the house, Honora's hand lay differently on his arm, not the light, unwilling touch of a girl performing a part, but the settled weight of a woman who has decided to trust and means it. He called again 2 days later, and again the day after that. He rode over from Vexshot, which was near 7 miles in all weathers, and he never once asked for the daughters. He brought Honora books, real books, chosen with care, and once a small volume of her father's own scholarship that he had gone to considerable trouble to find in a bookseller's in the county town, and when she opened it and saw her father's name on the title page, she had to leave the room. He walked with her in the gardens. He sat in the bad chair by the window, having quietly appropriated it as his own so that she should have a better one. He drew her out about her mother and her childhood and the books she loved, and he told her, slowly, in pieces, about his brother who had died and his cold marriage and the great empty house at Vexshot with its 40 rooms and its silence, and Honora listened, and something in the lonely, careful man began, under her listening, to unclench. It was near the end of that fortnight that the county assembly fell, the great autumn ball held each year in the long rooms above the county town, where every family of any pretension gathered to dance and to be seen, and to conduct the quiet business of the season under cover of the music. Lady Aldecott had subscribed for it months since, before ever the Duke came to her table, and she went in state with her daughters gowned to ruinous expense, and she took Honora too, because she dared not leave her behind now, with the Duke so plainly attentive, and because she nursed a small poisonous hope that in the crush and glitter of a proper ball, among 100 handsome, well-dowered girls, the great man's fancy for a plain grey nobody might at last be shown up for the passing whim she was determined it must be. She dressed Honora, therefore, with just enough care that no one could call it neglect, and just little enough that she should not shine. A plain gown of dove grey silk, good but unremarkable, no jewels, her hair done simply, and she seated her, when they arrived, along the wall among the chaperones and the wallflowers and the girls whom no one had asked, and there Honora sat, as she had sat below the salt, at the edge of the bright room, and watched the dancing, and did not expect to be asked, and had schooled her face long ago not to mind. The Duke of Vexshot did not dance. Everyone knew it. He had not stood up at an assembly in 10 years. It was one of the settled facts of the county, like the height of the church steeple. He came to the autumn ball because it was expected of a man of his consequence. And he stood at the edge of the floor with a glass he did not drink, and he was besieged, as he always was, by mothers steering their daughters into his path, and he endured it with the cold civility that earned him his name, and his eyes, all the while, were on the row of chaperones along the far wall, where a woman in dove grey sat straight-backed and quiet with her hands folded, watching the dancers with a small private pleasure she asked nothing to share. When the musicians struck up the next set, the Duke set down his glass. He crossed the floor. He crossed it in front of the whole assembled county, past the daughters and the mothers and the knots of gossiping matrons, exactly as he had once crossed a dinner table, and the room began to still around his passage the way water stills around a stone. And by the time he reached the row of wallflowers along the wall, the music itself seemed to falter, and the eyes of 200 people had turned to watch the Iron Duke, who did not dance, walk the length of the ballroom to a plain woman in grey whom no one asked to stand up. He bowed before her. "Miss Colville," he said, and his voice carried in the hush, "will you do me the honour?" Honora looked up at him. For an instant the old fear crossed her face, the fear of being made a spectacle, of being the sport of the room, and then she saw his hand held out to her, steady and sure. And she saw in his dark eyes not the wish to make a show, but only the plain wish to dance with her before them all rather than let her sit the evening out against the wall, and she put her hand in his and rose. And the whole county saw the Duke of Vexshot lead the poor relation out onto the floor and take his place with her at the head of the set. She had been taught to dance once by her mother in a warm parlour a lifetime ago, and though she had not stood up at a ball in 7 years, her feet remembered, and she found that with his hand at her waist and his eyes on her face, she was not afraid at all. He danced well, gravely, with the whole of his attention on her, as though the crowded, glittering room did not exist, and when the figure of the dance brought them together he spoke low, only for her, and when it parted them she carried his words like warmth across the cold space of the floor. "They are all watching," she murmured once when the dance brought them near. "Your Grace, they are all watching us." "Let them," said Torvald. "I have been giving this county something to watch for 10 years, Miss Colville, and it was always my temper, or my silence, or my grief. It is a great improvement, I find, to give them this instead." His hand tightened the smallest degree upon hers. "Let them watch. Let them go home and say the Duke of Vexshot danced at last, and see whom he chose, and understand it. I am tired of being a thing the county fears. I would very much rather be a man who danced with you." When the set ended he did not return her to the wall. He led her instead to the top of the room, to the chairs where the great families sat, and he presented her, "Miss Colville of Mariter blood, my particular friend," to the Lord Lieutenant's lady and to the Straiths, so that no one in that room could afterward pretend they did not know that the Duke's favour was fixed and public, and not to be sneered away. And he brought her lemonade, and stood at her shoulder, and Honora, who had come to the ball expecting to sit the whole of it against the wall, spent the rest of the evening at the head of the room on the arm of the most powerful man in the county, and bore it with a quiet grace that won her that night more true friends than 7 years of drudgery in her aunt's house had ever done. And across the room Lady Aldecott watched her plan to shame the girl into insignificance turn, like everything she had touched that season, into one more public monument to the Duke's devotion. And she smiled her fixed bright smile, and beneath it something went on hardening toward its final, ruinous shape. 2 days after the ball he took her to Vexshot, to his aunt. It was arranged with some difficulty, for Lady Aldecott had grown reluctant to let the girl out of her sight. But the Duke had proposed it in such a way, an invitation from Mistress Hale, a lady of unimpeachable respectability, to take tea with the Duke's carriage sent and return the same afternoon, that to refuse would have been an open insult he was plainly waiting to be given, and so Honora went. She sat alone in the great Vexshot carriage as it rolled up the long avenue between the limes, and she saw the house rise before her, grey and vast and beautiful and shut, 40 windows and not a curtain stirring, a house that looked as though it had been holding its breath for 10 years. And she thought, with a pang, of a lonely man walking its cold rooms at night, and she understood him a little better before ever she was through the door. Augusta Hale received her in a warm, cluttered sitting-room that was the one lived-in corner of all that grandeur, with a good fire and a fat old spaniel on the hearth and tea-things laid, and she took one look at Honora standing shy in the doorway in her dove-grey gown, and she set down her cup and held out both her thin hands and said, "Come here, child, and let me look at you. Yes, yes, you have her face. I would have known you anywhere for Marianne's girl." And her old eyes filled, and she did not hide it. "I knew your mother when she was your age. She sat in a room very like this one and read me poetry I did not understand and made me laugh until I wept, and she was the kindest creature God ever made, and they broke her for it, my own family and yours together, for loving where she was not told to love. I have been ashamed of it for 20 years. And now here you are, her very image, and you knelt in the rain for a stranger and pulled an old woman out of a smashed carriage, and I find the kindness bred true after all, whatever they did to try and starve it out of you. She patted the seat beside her. Sit. Sit here by me and drink your tea and tell me everything, and do not be afraid of me. I am a fierce old woman, but I am on your side, and there are precious few people in this world I would trouble to say that to. They talked the whole afternoon. Augusta told her of Marian, small stories. A girl's laughter, a wedding morning, things Honora had never heard and drank in like water in a drought. And Honora, warmed and unwatched for the first time in years, told more than she meant to of the cold north room, of the doubled work, of the books that were moved to punish her. And she saw the old woman's face harden, and she saw her exchange a look with the Duke, who sat quietly across the room letting the two of them alone, and she understood that they knew something she did not, and that they were keeping it from her out of some care she could not yet read. She did not press it. She had learned patience if she had learned nothing else, but she carried the sense of it home with her in the dark carriage, that these two people, the fierce old woman and the silent Duke, were holding something for her, guarding it, waiting for the right hour to put into her hands, and it was a strange and unaccustomed feeling to be guarded, and she turned it over all the long ride home and did not know whether it frightened her or warmed her more, and with every visit the temper of the house grew blacker. Lady Aldecott could not forbid the Duke the door. It was not to be thought of, but she could make Honora pay in the hours between his visits, and she did, with a cold ingenuity that Honora bore in silence, because she had learned that silence starved the cruelty of its sport. The work was doubled. The blue muslin was taken back. Sabina and Clarice took to leaving the room whenever Honora entered it, with a great show of skirts as though she carried something catching, and twice Honora came up to her cold north room to find her 3 books, her father's books, her only treasure, moved, or fallen open in the damp on the window-sill, or once, the worst time, with a page torn, and no one to accuse and nothing to be done, only the message, plain as speech. We can reach the things you love. Remember it. Honora remembered it. And she said nothing to the Duke, because she would make him a weapon in a war he did not know he was fighting, and because some stubborn pride in her would not let him see how small they had made her life. But she grew watchful. She had understood, since that morning in her room, that her aunt was afraid of something, and she had begun very quietly, in the hours when the house slept, to wonder what a woman like Lady Aldecott could possibly have to fear from a portionless orphan, and to remember that her grandfather, old Sir Hugh, had sent for her twice in the last year of his life and each time been prevented by her aunt from seeing her, and had died at last with her name, the housekeeper said, on his lips. One evening, when the family were out at cards at a neighbour's and the servants sat easy in the kitchen, Honora went down and sought out old Mrs. Pytle, the housekeeper, who had been 40 years in the house and had a soft spot for the girl she had watched grow up unloved. She found her by the kitchen fire with her mending, and she sat down beside her on the settle, and after a while of small talk, asked the thing she had been turning over for weeks. Mrs. Pytle, you were here when my grandfather died. Sir who? The old woman's needle paused. You told me once he asked for me at the end. I have never liked to speak of it, but I find lately I cannot stop thinking of it. Did he? Was there something he wished to say to me? Do you know? Mrs. Pytle looked at her a long moment over her spectacles, and glanced at the door, and lowered her voice. I have held my tongue 2 years, Miss Honora, for it is not my place and I am too old to lose my situation. But I will tell you this much for your poor mother's sake, and then I have said nothing, mind. The old master sent for you twice in his last winter. Twice I carried the messages up to her ladyship myself, that he wished his granddaughter brought to his bedside. And both times her ladyship said you were from home, or unwell, or not to be found, and you were none of those things, Miss Honora. You were in the still room not 30 feet off, and I knew it, and I said nothing, God forgive me. And at the very last, the night he died, he was calling a name. Not her ladyship's, not the young lady's. He called for Marian. That was your mother, dear, his own lost girl. And when they told him Marian was dead these long years, he wept, and he said, then the child, Send for the child. I have wronged her. It is all set right in the, and here Mrs. Pytle's voice dropped almost to nothing. It is all set right in the will. Tell her to look to the will. And then he was gone. And her ladyship was in the room, Miss Honora, and she heard it same as I did. And the next morning the lawyer came, and there was a deal of quiet talk behind closed doors, and you were never told a word. Honora sat very still by the fire. The will. Look to the will. It is all set right. A cold, clear understanding was assembling itself in her. Piece by piece, her aunt's fear, the guarded looks between the Duke and his aunt, the thing they were holding for her, and she felt the ground of her whole life shift a quarter turn beneath her. Thank you, Mrs. Pytle, she said quietly. You have said nothing. I will remember that you said nothing. She did not know the whole of what it meant, but she had begun, for the first time in 7 years, to want to find out. The blow, when it came the way such blows always came in that house, dressed as kindness, delivered in company, and aimed to break. It was 3 weeks into the Duke's courtship, and the county had talked of nothing else. Lady Aldecott had watched her daughter's prospects wither and her own consequence curdle into ridicule, and she had made her calculation, and she had chosen, since she could not keep the Duke from the door, to drive Honora out of it, if the girl could be made to seem grasping, dishonest, unchaste. If she should be caught in some shame before the Duke's own eyes, if he could be made to see her humbled and disgraced and to feel, as men of pride so easily feel, that he had been made a fool of, then he would recoil and go home, and Aldecott could gather up the pieces. So Lady Aldecott gave a dinner, a great one, larger than the first, and this time she invited the Duke's own peers, the Lord Lieutenant, the Earl of Straith and his Countess the Bishop, every family of consequence in the county, and she seated the Duke, this time, in the highest honour beside herself, and she seated Honora, this time as well, up among the family in a fine new gown of pale rose that Lady Aldecott had ordered made for her and presented with every appearance of generosity 3 days before. You are one of us now, my dear, she had said, laying the gown across Honora's narrow bed with her own hands. It would not do to shame the family before such company, seated below the salt. His Grace honours you, the family will honour you too. Wear it and hold your head up, and let no one say the Aldecotts do not know how to treat their own. Honora had looked at the gown and at her aunt's smiling face, and every instinct 7 years had sharpened in her had gone cold and still. Kindness from Lady Aldecott was the one weather she had never once seen turn out fair. But she could not refuse a gift given so publicly, before the servants, without an insult that would be turned against her, and so she thanked her aunt, and wore the rose gown, and went down to the great dinner with dread sitting in her like a stone. She had almost sent word to the Duke that afternoon. Twice she had taken up her pen, meaning to write him some warning she could not have named. I am afraid. Something is coming. I do not know what, and twice she had set it down again, ashamed, for what could she say? That her aunt had given her a fine gown and spoken kindly. He would think her a fool, or worse, an ungrateful girl who saw plots in every gift. And so she had said nothing, and dressed in the rose silk with her cold fingers clumsy at the fastenings, and looked at herself in the little glass. A stranger in a fine gown, pale, hunted about the eyes, and told herself that she was starting at shadows, that not every kindness in the world was a trap, that she must learn to let the past lie. She had almost believed it. That was the cruelest cut of all, she thought afterward, that for the space of an afternoon her aunt's false kindness had very nearly taught her to hope, only so that the fall might be the further. She went down the great stair with her chin up and her heart pounding, and the unfamiliar silk whispering at her heels, into the blaze of candlelight and the murmur of the greatest company that house had ever gathered, and every step of the way some animal part of her was listening. For the spring of the trap she could feel but could not see. She found her place with her name upon a card, high at the table, 3 seats from the Duke, among the Earls and the Bishop. She sat, and it was not until the second course, when the footman set before her a dish of stewed pears, and she reached, as she had been taught in 100 small trainings, for the correct spoon, that she felt the weight in the folds of her own skirt, where there should have been none, and understood, all in an instant and far too late, what had been done. For at that moment Lady Aldecott set down her glass, and her voice rang out down the table, bright and terrible and grieved. Honora, my love, you have dropped something. There, in your lap. What is that? Every face turned, and Honora, looking down, saw the corner of something bright caught in the pale rose folds of the gown she had been given, a chain, a glitter of stones, and knew, with a sick lurch, that it was the diamond and sapphire necklace that was the great treasure of the Aldecott house. Piece that lived in a locked case in Lady Aldecott's own dressing room, and that it had been sewn or slipped into the seam of the gift gown by hands that had planned this hour for a week, and that she was about to be denounced before the Lord Lieutenant and the Earl of Straith and the Bishop, and the whole assembled consequence of the county, and above all before the Duke, as a thief. My necklace! Lady Aldecott was on her feet, one hand pressed to her breast, her face a marvel of maternal grief and horror. My mother's necklace, the one I missed this very morning. Oh, Honora, Honora, no. After all we have done for you, after we took you in and fed you and raised you as our own, you would steal from us? Under our own roof, before our guests. She turned to the table, to the great cold shocked faces of the county, and her voice broke beautifully. I did not want to believe it. When it went missing I told myself it could not be, that no one so favoured could be so base. I see I have been a fool for kindness all my life. Search her. I am sorry, am so sorry, but you must all see it, or you will think I accuse her falsely. Someone, please, take it from her. The hall had gone deathly silent. The Countess of Straith had a hand at her throat. The Bishop's face was long with sorrow, and Honora sat frozen in the pale rose gown with the stolen necklace glittering in her lap for all the world to see, and she understood that there was no word she could say that would not sound like the lie of a caught thief, that the trap was perfect, that the gown had been the bait and the seating the stage, and the whole of it built to end her here. And she felt the old cold dignity come down over her like a visor, and she rose to her feet, very pale, very straight, and she did not weep, and she did not beg, and she said, in a voice that carried clear and steady down the whole length of the silent table, I did not take it. This gown was given me by my aunt's own hands 3 days since, and I have not had it out of my sight nor put it on until this hour, and I did not know that was in it, and I did not put it there. That is the truth. I have nothing but the truth, and I know it will not be believed, because you have all already decided what I am. But I will say it standing, and I will say it once, I am no thief. Whatever else has been done to me in this house, I have never in my life taken what was not mine. It was well said, it was bravely said, and in another room, before other people, it might even have served. But Honora saw the faces along the table, and she saw that it had not served, saw the pity and the disgust and the certainty settling over them. For the county had come prepared to be scandalized by the Duke's low favourite, and here was their scandal delivered gift wrapped, and a great lady weeping was more to be believed than a portionless orphan standing white and alone. She saw the Earl of Straith look away. She saw the Bishop shake his head. She saw that she was lost, and then the Duke of Vexshot spoke. He had not risen. He sat quite still in his place of honour, and he had watched the whole of it unfold with an attention so complete and so cold that those near him would say afterward it had frightened them more than any shouting could have done, the stillness of a man watching a thing he has been waiting for. Now he set down his glass, and into the silence, in a voice quiet and pleasant and utterly without mercy, he said, "Before anyone touches Miss Colville, madam, I wonder if you would answer me one small question, for my own understanding." Lady Aldecott mid-sobbed. "Your Grace," you said, Torvald went on, in the same mild, terrible voice, "that you missed the necklace this very morning. That is what you said, just now, before this company, that you missed it this morning and feared and hoped you were wrong." He let it sit. "But the gown was given to Miss Colville 3 days ago. She has just told us so, and you have not contradicted her. And a dozen of your own servants saw you carry it up to a room, so it is not a thing you can now deny. 3 days ago." He tilted his head. "So I confess I am puzzled, Lady Aldecott. If the necklace was sewn into a gown 3 days ago, and only went missing this morning, then either your treasure walked into that seam by itself, some hours after it was sewn shut, which I think we may set aside, or you are mistaken about this morning. Which is it? Take your time. The Lord Lieutenant is listening, and he is, I believe, a magistrate, as am I. The silence changed its quality entirely. Lady Aldercott's mouth opened. No sound came out of it. Torvald watched her grope for the answer that was not there, for there was no answer. She had built her lie too fast and sprung it too soon, and the Duke, who had sat through 100 cruel dinners and learned to hear the machinery grinding beneath the tears, had caught the one loose cog, and put his finger on it before all the county. To say the necklace had gone this morning was to say it could not have been in a 3-day-old gown. To say it had gone 3 days ago was to admit she had cried a false alarm and let a girl sit down to dinner. She already believed a thief without a word of warning. Every road led into the pit she had dug for another. I misspoke, she said at last in a voice gone thin. I missed it some days since. Then you knew it was gone, said Torvald, for some days, and said nothing. And gave the very gown with the jewel in it to your niece with your own hands, and seated her high at your table before the Lord Lieutenant, and waited for the second course to cry thief. Some days you knew, and you planned an audience. He rose now at last, unhurried, and the whole hall came up out of their chairs a little in their shock, and he walked, as he had walked once before, down the length of a table, and every soul in that room who had heard the first story felt the second one land like a bell. He walked to where Honora stood white and swaying in her pale rose gown, and he stood beside her, at her shoulder, facing them all. "Send for your servants, madam," he said. "Send for the woman who made this gown, and the maid who carried it up, and the girl who dresses your hair and had the keeping of your jewel case. Send for all of them, and let the Lord Lieutenant question them here tonight, before this company you gathered to see a thief unmasked. Let us unmask one. I am content to wait." He looked around the great table at the earls and the bishop and the frozen guests, and his voice dropped lower and colder still. "But I will tell you now what they will say, and I will stake my name and my honor upon it, so that no one here may pretend afterward they did not know. This lady is no thief. She was given a poisoned gift by a woman who has robbed her of a great deal more than a necklace, and who feared, rightly, that her thieving was about to be found out, and who chose to cry thief first and loudest, and drown the truth in a girl's disgrace before it could be spoken. That is what happened at this table tonight, and I mean to prove every word of it before I am done." He turned to Honora then, and all the cold went out of his face, and he offered her his arm. "Come," he said gently, "you need not stand here to be looked at any longer. You have stood enough in this house for a lifetime of women. Come away." But Honora did not take his arm, not yet, though every fibre of her ached to. She had stood white and swaying a moment before. Now something had come into her that was stronger than fear, and she turned to face the table one last time, because she had understood in the space of the Duke's questioning the shape of the whole thing at last. The fear she had seen in her aunt's face weeks ago, the moved books, the prevented meetings with a dying grandfather, the whole 7-year architecture of her smallness. And she found she could not walk away from it silent. Not now. Not with a man of honor standing at her shoulder and the county listening. "You said I had robbed you," she said, and her voice did not shake now at all. "You have said it 100 ways in 7 years, aunt, that I am a burden, a charity, a debt the family carries, that I take and give nothing. I have believed it. I have scrubbed and nursed and gone without and been grateful, because I believed I owed it." She drew a breath. "But I have begun to wonder, this last month, why a family should fear a debtor so. Why my grandfather sent for me twice in his last year, and was turned from my door each time. Why he died, they say, with my name on his lips. Why my books get moved when I displease you as a warning, as though I had something to lose. I do not know the answer. But His Grace has promised to find it, and I believe he will, and I think, aunt, that when it is found, we shall all of us learn who has been robbing whom." Lady Aldercott's face, which had gone thin and grey, now went the colour of ash, and it was that, the naked terror that leapt into her eyes at the word grandfather, the involuntary glance she threw down the table at her silent husband, that told the whole listening company, more surely than any proof, that the girl had struck bone. The Lord Lieutenant, an old fair-minded man who had come to a scandal and found himself in the middle of something graver, rose slowly to his feet. "Aldecott," he said to the master of the house, who had not spoken one word through the whole of it and sat now grey and stricken in his chair, I think you had best send for those servants, as his grace advises. And I think, before this company, you had best tell me plainly, as you will one day tell it under oath, for I am minded to look into it, what portion your father left to this young woman, and where it has been these 2 years, and by whose hand its rents have been drawn. But before Lord Aldecott could answer, the matter was taken out of his hands, for the Duke's demand of an hour past had not been idle, and a footman had already gone, on the Lord Lieutenant's own nod, to fetch the servants named. They came now into the great hall. The seamstress who had made the rose gown, a frightened woman twisting her apron, the maid who had carried it up to Honora's room, and last, the girl who dressed Lady Aldecott's hair and kept the key of her jewel case. And they stood in a huddle at the foot of the great table before all the assembled county, and the Lord Lieutenant, in his mild magistrate's voice, put his questions. It did not take long. The seamstress swore, weeping, that she had sewn the gown plain and whole, and there had been no jewel in any seam of it when it left her hands, and that she would swear it on the book. And the little lady's maid, white as her cap, being asked plainly by a Lord Lieutenant whether her mistress' necklace had truly gone missing that morning, looked once in terror at Lady Aldecott, and then at the great grave men waiting, and understood on which side her own neck lay, and broke. "It never went missing at all, my lord," she whispered, and the words fell into the silent hall like stones into a well. "Her ladyship had me fetch it from the case 3 days since. The very evening the gown was sent up, and she bid me say nothing, and this morning she told me if anyone asked I was to say it had gone from the case in the night. I did not know what was for, my lord. I swear I did not, or I would never." And here the poor girl dissolved entirely, and there was no need of any more, for the whole county had heard it, plain, from the mouth of the woman's own servant. The necklace had never been stolen. It had been planted. And the crying of the theft, and the audience gathered to hear it, and the pale rose gown given with such show of kindness 3 days before, were all of them one machine, built by one hand, to break one girl. A sound went round the great table, lo, the sound of 24 well-bred people all drawing breath at once. The bishop set down his glass very slowly. The Countess of Strath turned to look at Lady Aldecott with an expression that would have withered a stone. Lord Aldecott looked at the Lord Lieutenant. He looked at the Duke of Vexshot standing implacable at the girl's shoulder. He looked, last and longest, at his wife, whose scheme had brought all of this down upon his head in front of every man whose good opinion he valued, and Lord Aldecott, who was not a wicked man so much as a weak one, who had let himself be led into an injustice year by year, because it was easier and it was profitable and his wife had willed it. Lord Aldecott put his face in his hands, and the whole county saw him do it, and that was answer enough. The rest came out over the following days in the lawyer's office and the magistrate's parlour, but the heart of it was told that very night, and it was this: old Sir Hugh, repenting at the last of the coldness his elder daughter had taught him toward the younger, had left to Honora her mother's dower estate, a good manor and 800 a year, at a place called Grange that had been her mother's girlhood home, to come to her at her marriage or her 25th year. The will was lodged, as the law required, in the diocesan registry, and the Duke's discreet man of business had drawn a true copy of it a fortnight since, and it lay now in Torvald's own strong-box. For 2 years the Aldecotts had suppressed it. They had drawn the rents of Grange and spent them, and they had kept the girl in ignorance and in drudgery, and they had schemed to see her never married and never 25, any way that mattered, driven out, disgraced, immured, gone, so that the day of reckoning might be put off forever and the estate quietly swallowed. The necklace had been the last throw of a frightened woman who had felt, in the Duke's courtship, the whole edifice beginning to tip. Honora heard the substance of it that night, standing in the cold splendour of the great hall while the county murmured and the candles guttered, and she did not weep and she did not crow. She stood very still while the shape of her whole stolen life turned itself right way up before her, and then she said, quietly to no one in particular, "Grange, my mother used to tell me of it. There is an orchard," she said, "and a green door, and a window seat where she read as a girl." Her voice caught. "I thought it was a story. I thought it was only a story she told me to fall asleep by." "It is your home," said Torvald. "It has been yours these 2 years, and it will be yours in law within the week. and no one, he did not raise his voice, but every soul in the hall heard it. No one in this county will ever again seat you below the salt, or dress you in a poisoned gown, or tell you what you are. You know now what you are. You are Honora Colville of Marita Grange, and your grandfather loved you, and your mother's home is waiting for you with its green door and its orchard, and you need never sleep another night under this roof. The Countess of Strath, who had been the coldest face at the table an hour before, rose from her seat and crossed the room, and to the astonishment of everyone, took Honora's cold hands in both her own. "My dear," she said, "I believed the worst of you tonight, in the space of a minute, on a wicked woman's word, and I am ashamed of it, and I ask your pardon. You will come to us, if you will, until your own house is ready. Strath is but 4 miles off, and I should be glad, I should be honoured to have you." And the Countess looked over Honora's head at the Duke, and something passed between the two of them, and the Duke inclined his head, and the thing was arranged. Honora would not spend one more night at Aldecott Court. They gathered her few things, her 3 books, her mother's note, the pitiful bundle that was 7 years' accumulation of a life kept deliberately bare, and it took less than a quarter of an hour, and the smallness of it when the footman carried it out to the Strath carriage made more than one hard county face turn quietly away. Lady Aldecott was not in the hall to see her go. She had retired, they said, unwell. She would be a great deal more unwell before the lawyers were done. But that reckoning belonged to other rooms, and Honora, standing on the steps of Aldecott Court in the cold starlight with a duke on one side of her and a countess on the other, found she had no wish to watch it. She had spent enough of her life in that house. She did not mean to spend her freedom there too. Torvald handed her into the Strath carriage himself. At the door of it he paused, and kept her hand a moment, and looked at her in the light of the carriage lamps, pale still, and worn with the night, but with something come alive in her face that 7 years had buried, a woman waking up inside her own life. "I told you I would find it," he said, low, for her alone. "The thing your aunt was afraid of, I found it. It was yours all along." "You did more than find it," Honora said. Her eyes shone. "You stood beside me when I had no proof and no name and nothing in the world but the truth, and you staked your honour on my word before the whole county, when it would have cost you nothing to doubt me as they all doubted me. Do you know what that is, your grace, to a person who has not been believed in 7 years?" Her voice broke on it. "You believed me. Before you had your proof. You believed me because I said it was so. I did not know a person could be believed like that. I did not know it was a thing that happened." "It is a thing that happens," said Torvald, "to people who have never told a lie in their lives, and it is a great pity it is so rare. Get in, before you take a chill. I will call at Strath tomorrow." And Honora, she turned back. He was not a man to whom such words came easily. She could see the cost of them in the set of his jaw, and she treasured it. "I have crossed the room twice now. Once at a dinner, and once tonight. I do not mean to cross it a 3rd time to ask you a question I could ask you now. But you are worn to the bone, and it has been the worst night of your life, or nearly, and I will not have you say yes to me out of gratitude in the dark on a doorstep, so I will not ask you tonight. I will ask you when your own house has its green door open and its orchard in bloom, and you are standing in it free, owing me nothing, wanting nothing, your own woman on your own ground. And then if the answer is yes, I will know it is yours and not your fears. Can you wait that long?" "I have waited 7 years for very much worse things," said Honora, and she was laughing and crying at once. "I can wait a little while for the best one." He shut the carriage door. He stepped back. And the Strath carriage rolled down the long drive of Aldecott Court and out through the gates, carrying Honora Colville away from that house forever, into the cold bright starlit night, toward a green door she had thought was only a story. The lawyers were not slow. Once a duke and a lord lieutenant stood behind the matter. Within the fortnight the true copy of Sir Hugh's will had done its work, and Marita Grange, with its 800 a year and its 2 years of withheld rents to be accounted for, passed into the hands of Honora Colville, its rightful mistress. The accounting of those rents, and certain other matters touching the suppression of a lodged will, went hard with the Aldecotts. Lord Aldecott was obliged to sell land to make restitution, and to do it publicly, and to sit in his pew each Sunday under the cool eyes of a county that now knew exactly what he was. Lady Aldercott's health, which had failed so conveniently on the night of the dinner, did not soon recover. She went to Bath and stayed there, and the doors of the great houses that had once opened to her opened no longer, for the county forgave many things, but it did not forgive a woman who would sew a jewel into an orphan's gown and cry thief before a bishop. Sabina and Clarice married in time and modestly, and a good deal beneath what their mother had schemed for, and if there is a lesson in that, it is one they were left to learn without Honora's help, for she never troubled herself to think of them again if she could help it, and mostly she could. But all of that belonged to the cold rooms of law and consequence, and Honora spent very little of her new freedom there. She spent it that autumn at Strath, where the Countess proved as good as her word, and a great deal better, a brisk, kind, clever woman who took the half-starved girl in hand and fed her up and dressed her, over her protests, in gowns that fit, and drew out of her, evening by evening before the fire, 7 years of swallowed grief, and taught her, without ever once seeming to teach her, that she need not brace herself for a blow every time a door opened. It was slow work. 7 years do not lift off a person in a night. There were mornings still when Honora woke before dawn, and reached for the coal scuttle out of an old habit of dread before she remembered where she was, and wept a little, quietly from sheer relief, and let the maid bring her chocolate in a bed she did not have to earn. But she healed. The sea-coloured eyes lost their wariness by degrees. She laughed more easily. She grew that autumn into the woman she had always been underneath, the one Lady Aldecott had spent 7 years trying to smother and had never quite put out. And the Duke of Vexshot came, not every day. He had promised her own ground and her own freedom, and he kept it, as he kept all his promises, tediously, but often, riding the miles between Vexshot and Strath in all the weather of a hardening autumn, and he did not press her, and he did not ask his question. Though it stood plainly in his face every time he looked at her, he waited. He was, Honora came to understand, the most patient man alive with the things that mattered, having spent a lifetime learning to wait for a happiness he had not believed would ever come. And now that it had come, he would not spoil it by grasping. He waited for the green door. They went to Marret-a-Grange together in the last week of October, on a still gold morning with the frost just off the grass. It was a smaller house than Honora had let herself imagine and lovelier than she had dared to hope. A warm old manor of grey stone and mullioned windows, set in a fold of the hills with an orchard running down to a stream, and the caretaker's wife had lit fires in the aired rooms and set the last of the year's chrysanthemums in a jug on the hall table, and when Honora came to the door she stopped, for it was painted green, a soft-weathered green, exactly as her mother had said, and above the door there was a window, and behind that window, when she went up, there was a deep seat beneath the casement where a girl might sit and read in the light, exactly as her mother had said. And Honora Colville sat down in her mother's window seat in her mother's house, at long last, and put her face in her hands and wept as she had not wept in all the terrible years, because some griefs can only be cried out in the arms of the thing you were promised and thought you had lost. Torval did not follow her up. He waited below in the orchard among the last apples and gave her the house to herself, and her mother and her long weeping, for as long as she needed, because he understood that a person must be let to arrive somewhere before they can be asked to leave it for anywhere else, even a place as good as the one he meant to offer. She came down to him at length in the middle of the morning, out into the orchard where he stood bareheaded in the gold light with his horse cropping grass at the wall. Her eyes were red and her face was washed clean, and there was a peace in it he had not seen there before, the deep-settled peace of a person who has come home. She walked to him across the frosted grass under the apple boughs, and she stopped before him, and she looked up at him, and she said, before he could speak at all, "You said you would ask me when I was standing free on my own ground, owing you nothing, wanting nothing, my own woman." A small tremulous smile. "I am standing on my own ground, your grace. It has a green door, exactly as she said. I owe nothing to any living soul that I did not earn or was not left me by those who loved me. I am free. I have money of my own and a house of my own and a name of my own that no one can ever take from me again, and I could live out my whole life here in this orchard, alone and safe and beholden to no one, and want for nothing in the world." Her voice dropped. Her eyes filled again, but she did not look away. "Except that I would want for you. That is the one thing this house cannot give me, and the one thing I find I cannot do without. So I will save you the crossing of the room a third time, Torvald, and I will ask it myself, since I am my own woman now and may do as I please. Will you have me? Not the Duke and the charity girl, not the rescuer and the rescued. Only us, only a lonely man and a woman who was made small and would not stay small. Will you have me and stay, and let me stay for the rest of our lives?" For a moment the Duke of Vexshot, who had faced down a county without a flicker, could not speak at all. Then he took her face in both his hands, gently, as though with the one fragile and precious thing in a hard world, and he said roughly, "I crossed a rue in front of 22 people, because I could not sit still and watch them make you small. I would cross the whole of England on my knees to hear you ask me that. Yes, God, yes. I have been waiting for you for 38 years, and I did not know your name until a wheel broke in the rain, and yes, and always, and there is no other answer in me." And he kissed her once, in her mother's orchard under the last of the apples, in the clean gold October light, and it was nothing like the cold contract of his first marriage and everything he had stopped believing a man might have, and Honora Colville, who had been seated below the salt and dressed in a poison gown and told for 7 years exactly what she was worth, put her arms around the neck of the man who had crossed the room and held on, and was held, and knew at last, all the way down to the bone, precisely what she was worth. Which was this: they were married in the spring, at the little church near Maritagrange, with the orchard in bloom beyond the churchyard wall exactly as she had imagined it since she was a girl. The Countess of Strath stood up with her, and Mistress Augusta Hale, sharp-tongued and warm-fired and 80 if she was a day, wept without shame in the front pew, and declared to anyone who would listen that she had made the match herself by the simple expedient of overturning her carriage in the rain, which was not true, but which no one had the heart to argue. Half the county came, the same half that had watched a girl denounced as a thief and half believed it. They came now to see her made a duchess, and they were civil, and Honora was gracious to them, and forgave them more easily than they perhaps deserved, because she had learned that carrying old cruelties was a weight, and she had carried enough weight for one life, and meant to set it down. The Aldecots were not invited, and did not come, and were not missed. There was, some years into her marriage, a single small scene that the servants at Vexshot told and retold for a generation, because it seemed to them to hold the whole of their mistress in it. The new Duchess was giving a great dinner, her first truly grand one, with the Lord Lieutenant and the Straiths and half the peerage of the county at her long table, and among the guests, seated far down toward the foot as such persons always were, was a poor governess, a Miss Rush, come as companion to a dowager and plainly braced all evening to be overlooked, sitting very straight and quiet with her mended gloves and her frightened dignity, asking nothing, expecting nothing, eating little because the dishes were sent up the table and seldom sent down. The Duchess of Vexshot saw her. Of course she saw her. She had spent 7 years being her. And in the middle of the second course, before the Lord Lieutenant and the peerage and the whole bright glittering length of her own table, the Duchess rose from her place of honour and gathered her skirts and walked the length of the room. And every soul who knew the story of how her own husband had once crossed a table for her felt the hair rise on their arms, and she came to the foot of the table, and she drew up a chair beside the frightened governess, and she sat down, and she said warmly, so that all could hear, "Miss Rush, I have wanted to speak with you all evening, and I find I cannot do it from a mile off. Come, tell me about your charges, and let these grand people shout at one another without us." And she stayed there at the foot of her own table, beside the woman no one had troubled to see, for the whole of the meal, and Miss Rush, who had come expecting to be a shadow, went home having dined beside a duchess who had sought her out on purpose, and never in her life forgot it. That was the kind of duchess Honora made. She had learned exactly what a chair drawn up beside you could mean, on the worst night of her life, and she spent the rest of her days spending that knowledge on others. She was a good duchess in the years that followed, though the word never sat easily on her. She was better than good. She knew, as those born to it never quite know, what it was to be the person below the salt, The dependent, the one whose dignity is a thing others feel free to spend, and she never once, in all her life at Vexshot, let a soul be seated below the salt at a table, nor spoke a cutting word to a servant, nor let a poor relation or a plain governess or a friendless traveller go unwarmed at her fire. The great cold house that had stood silent for a decade filled with light and voices. The 40 rooms were opened. Children came in their time and grew up in a house where no one was ever made small, and were taught by their father, who was reckoned, to the county's lasting astonishment, the gentlest man in 3 counties, whatever they had once called him, that you may know the whole worth of a person by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them in return. And on winter evenings, when the candles were lit and the fire was high and the long day's business done, the Duke of Vexshot would sometimes look across the room at his wife, where she sat reading in the deep window seat she had ordered built at Vexshot to match the one at Marita Grange, the lamplight in her hair and one of her father's books open in her hands, and he would get up out of his own comfortable chair and cross the room, the whole width of it, and draw up a chair beside hers, close at her shoulder, and sit down. And every time he did it she would look up and smile at him, that quick unguarded smile he had crossed a room to earn on the worst night of her life, and every time she would say the same thing, softly, only for him, their oldest joke and their truest one. "You found the best seat in the house, then?" And every time he would answer, taking her hand, as though it were the first time and the only time and the last, "I found it the moment I sat down beside you. I have never wanted any other. I never will."